In April 1945, a Soviet captain named Ivan Vedmedenko did something the engineers who built his weapon never planned for. He dragged a 17-ton siege howitzer through the rubble of a Berlin street, set it up within visual range of a reinforced concrete tower the Luftwaffe had thought indestructible, and started firing at point-blank range. 11 days later, the Flak tower was a ruin. Vedmedenko was nominated for Hero of the Soviet Union, and the weapon that did the work had been sitting in the Red Army's inventory for over a decade, designed in a different decade for a completely different war. This is the story of the B-4, the Soviet sledgehammer the Red Army built because conventional artillery had failed them in the snow of Finland, and which they would eventually unleash 6 years later on the streets of the capital of Nazi Germany. 6 years before Vedmedenko fired that first shell, the Red Army had a problem that conventional artillery could not solve. It was December 1939. Soviet infantry were dying in waves on a frozen forest line called the Mannerheim Line, and the guns that were supposed to clear their path had stopped working. Not literally stopped working. The guns fired, the shells flew. The 76mm rounds and the 122mm howitzers crashed into Finnish concrete bunkers along the Karelian Isthmus, all day, every day. They left scorch marks, they cracked the surface, they did not get through. And that was the problem. The Finns had spent 20 years engineering the Mannerheim Line, specifically to absorb what the Soviet army could throw at it. Walls thick enough to laugh at fragmentation, embrasures angled to deflect direct hits, bunker crowns that shrugged off everything short of a direct strike from a weapon much, much bigger than anything in a rifle division's inventory. Soviet commanders watched their men die in front of concrete that would not break. They called in heavier batteries. The heavier batteries did not work either. At Suma, the strongest sector of the line, Finnish machine guns kept sweeping the Soviet assault waves from inside bunkers that had taken everything the Red Army could fire and were still standing. That was when somebody in Moscow realized this was not a tactics problem. It was a hardware problem. The artillery the Red Army owned was built to kill men in open fields. It could not break a modern fortification. And until the Soviet Union had a gun that could, this kind of warfare was going to keep being a slaughter. But the answer to that problem was already sitting on Soviet drawing boards. It had been there for almost a decade. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Main Artillery Directorate had quietly commissioned a weapon for exactly this situation. They handed the project to a design team at the Bolshevik plant in Leningrad, under an engineer named N.N. Magdasiev. The specification was specific and unusual. Build us a 203mm howitzer, build it big enough to crush concrete, and give it tracks, because Soviet mud will swallow anything with wheels. That last part was the part that mattered. Western siege guns of that era were monsters on wheels, things that needed roads and time and engineering preparation to set up. The Soviets did not have roads in any reliable sense. They had Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud that turned the Western Soviet Union into a swamp twice a year. Any weapon that had to be towed on rubber tires through that was going to bog down before it ever reached a target. So Magdasiev's team made a decision. They put the entire weapon on a tracked carriage. The howitzer itself was a brute, a barrel weighing tons that fired a 98.8 kilogram shell. But the carriage underneath it was designed to crawl. It could move across terrain that would have stopped any wheeled siege gun in the world. That choice came with a cost, and a big one. A tracked siege gun is mechanically complicated. It needs constant maintenance. Its rate of fire is slow because everything about it is heavy, including the loading procedure. The crew that operated it numbered around 15 men, each one doing a specific job at a specific moment in a sequence that took roughly 2 minutes per shell. 2 minutes for one round. That is the kind of pace that makes accountants cry, and it tells you exactly what this weapon was built for. It was not built for rapid fire. It was built for permanence. You point it at something concrete and you wait. The official designation was the 203mm Howitzer M1931. The service index was B4, and by the time the Mannerheim Line stopped the Red Army cold in 1939, the B4 had been in production for almost a decade, mostly forgotten by everyone outside the Artillery Directorate. Then Finland happened, and the B4 got its first real job. Soviet planners ordered the weapon forward to break the Mannerheim Line, and once it arrived, the same Finnish bunkers that had absorbed everything else stopped working. The B4's 98.8 kilogram shells did not bounce. They punched into concrete crowns. They collapsed bunker roofs that had survived weeks of lighter bombardment. They opened gaps in the line at places that had been completely impassable. The Winter War ended in March 1940, with the Soviet Union taking the Karelian Isthmus and the Finns negotiating a brutal peace. The B4 had not won that war on its own. Nothing did. But it had proven its job description. Modern concrete fortifications, the kind that defeated divisional artillery, could be broken by a 203mm shell delivered with patience. Soviet artillery doctrine absorbed the lesson. Production at the Barricady plant in Stalingrad continued through the late 1930s and into the war years. Heavy artillery brigades trained with the weapon, and then, in June 1941, the entire strategic situation changed. When Operation Barbarossa hit, the Red Army was forced backwards across Soviet territory, in a retreat that would not stop for almost 2 years. Heavy siege artillery was the last thing anybody needed in a war of mobility. The B4 spent most of 1941 and 1942 doing very little. There was no Mannerheim Line to break. There were only German panzer columns moving faster than anyone could counter. But Germany's own strategic decisions would eventually create exactly the kind of targets the B4 had been waiting for. As the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into the Soviet Union, German engineers built fortified strongpoints behind their lines. As Hitler's grip on his retreating armies tightened in 1943, German positions started digging in instead of falling back. And as the Red Army turned the war around and began pushing west, the kind of warfare that had defined the Mannerheim Line came back. Except now, the Soviets were on the attacking side. The B4 had a target-rich environment again. If this is the kind of military history that answers the questions other channels skip past, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next part of this story, what this weapon actually did when it reached Berlin, is the part nobody covers in detail. So, a Soviet siege gun designed in the early 1930s, proven against Finnish bunkers in 1940, mostly idle through the disasters of 1941 and 42. By late 1944, it was rolling west again, attached to heavy artillery brigades of the First Belarusian Front, headed for the city that would define everything the weapon was ever going to be remembered for. The First Belarusian Front reached the eastern outskirts of Berlin in mid-April 1945. The German defense of the city was not coherent in any traditional military sense. It was a patchwork of Volkssturm militia, Waffen-SS holdouts, Hitler Youth, and the broken remnants of what had once been the Wehrmacht. But the city itself was the obstacle. Years of construction had turned Berlin into a labyrinth of fortified buildings, reinforced cellars, and 3 massive flak towers built specifically to be impossible to destroy. The flak towers were the centerpiece of the German defensive plan. 3 of them, at Zoo, Friedrichshain, and Humboldthain, were reinforced concrete fortresses with walls measuring up to 3.5 meters thick at their thickest sections. They mounted heavy anti-aircraft guns that could be depressed to fire directly at advancing Soviet armor. They housed civilian shelters, command posts and field hospitals, and they were designed, from the foundation up, to survive anything an army could throw at them. The Zoo flak tower was the one that would meet the B4. Heavy artillery brigade commanders made a decision that was not in any pre-war Soviet manual. Instead of using the B4 the way it had been designed, as a long-range siege piece firing on map coordinates from kilometers behind the front, they brought it forward. Crews moved it through Berlin's streets under cover of smoke and rubble, often within visual range of the targets they were going to engage. They set it up at street intersections, in courtyards, sometimes literally in the middle of a road, and they fired direct at concrete. Captain Ivan Mikhailovich Vedmedenko was one of those officers. According to Soviet sources, his battery engaged the WWII Flak tower over roughly 11 days of bombardment, sending 98.8-kilogram concrete-piercing shells into walls that had been built to laugh at anything smaller. The concrete-piercing rounds had been designed for exactly this situation. They were thick-walled steel projectiles with delayed action fuses, meaning the shell would punch into the concrete before exploding inside the structure. Every hit took a piece of the tower with it. 11 days later, what had been the largest urban fortification on the German side of the war was no longer functional. Vedmedenko was decorated as a hero of the Soviet Union. The citation was for direct fire engagement of fortified positions, which is the kind of bland military language that hides what actually happened. What actually happened was that a Soviet captain and his crew dragged a weapon roughly the size of a small railway car into a city under attack, set it up where they could see what they were shooting at, and physically broke a building the Luftwaffe had thought indestructible. They did it under counter-battery fire, they did it under sniper fire, and they did it with a weapon that fired one round every 2 minutes, which means every single loading cycle was its own small drama, played out in the open against an enemy that was still very much alive. The German response to Soviet super-heavy artillery is its own grim story. As B-4 batteries began grinding through Berlin's fortifications, German engineers tried to repair what they could. Rubble was packed back into breaches. Timber and steel salvaged from destroyed buildings was used to rebuild barricades that had been pulverized the night before. Underground bunker systems were extended because anything above ground could be reached by Soviet shells. But the math did not work in Germany's favor. Each B-4 impact was, in pure economic terms, a catastrophe for the defenders. A 203mm concrete-piercing shell took out a section of fortification that had cost months to build. The Soviets, on the other hand, just reloaded. That economic asymmetry is part of why the war ended the way it ended. The B-4 was never a war-winning weapon on its own. There were only around 100 of them ever built across the entire pre-war and wartime production run, which makes it one of the rarest pieces of heavy artillery in the Red Army's inventory. But the small number of B-4 batteries the Soviets did have were used at precisely the points where they mattered most. Whatever they hit, the Germans could not rebuild fast enough. Then the war ended, and the question became what to do with the weapon afterwards. The Soviets had already tried to make the B-4 self-propelled. The project, called the S-51, mounted the gun's oscillating parts on a heavy tank chassis. Trials at the Gorokhovets proving grounds in March and April 1944 did not go well. When the prototype fired, the recoil from the 203mm cartridge violently displaced the entire vehicle. The hull jumped backwards by more than a meter. The transmission was damaged. The whole platform was unstable enough that it could not be used in combat. The project did not enter production. After the war, Soviet engineers came back to the B-4 with a different approach. They left the gun itself alone. The barrel, the recoil system, the ammunition, all of that worked fine. What they changed was the carriage. The original tracked carriage was complex, slow on roads, and maintenance-intensive. The modernization program, called the B-4M, refurbished the surviving B-4 guns onto a four-wheeled carriage suited for post-war towing. The weapon kept its punch. It just stopped being a crawler. The B-4M served in the Soviet artillery into the 1950s, when newer heavy systems began to replace it. By that point, the entire concept of a towed siege gun with a 15-man crew firing one round every 2 minutes was being made obsolete by guided weapons and self-propelled artillery. But the B-4 had outlived its design specification by 20 years, and it had been used in ways its engineers never anticipated. Which brings us back to a Berlin street in April 1945. A Soviet captain, who would never be a famous name outside Russia, standing next to a weapon almost as old as the war itself, looking up at the side of the WWII Flak tower through gunsmoke. The weapon was designed in a different decade, for a different enemy, for a different kind of war. It had been built to break concrete bunkers along a forest line in Finland that most Western histories barely mention. But the specification an engineer wrote in Leningrad in the early 1930s turned out to be the exact specification Berlin would need a solution to in 1945. The B-4 did not become famous. It barely shows up in Western histories of the war. There were only around 100 of them ever built. But where they showed up, what they hit, did not stand back up. Vedmedenko got his hero of the Soviet Union. The B-4 kept serving into the 1950s, and the Zoo Flak Tower, the indestructible concrete colossus the Luftwaffe had built to survive anything an enemy army could throw at it, was reduced to a quiet ruin by a Soviet captain firing one round every 2 minutes for 11 days. If you want to keep going down this rabbit hole, next week I am breaking down the German super heavy weapon the Soviets feared more than any other piece of Wehrmacht artillery. Subscribe so you do not miss it.